Hello and welcome to World Talks, and I'm your host, Sasha Farbach. Now, President Donald Trump expressed optimism on Friday, stating that a full ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine could be reached, quote, very soon. He highlighted the success of last week's partial ceasefire on energy and civilian infrastructure, now noting that it was held up well. Now, despite multiple strikes in the past days, primarily on infrastructure, however, Trump did acknowledge that the daily images from Ukraine presented a stark contrast. Now, Trump added that following the ceasefire, a broader agreement, potentially involving territorial changes, would be negotiated. Now, to dive deeper into the current state of the peace process for Ukraine, we're joined by Jacek Raubo, Director, Defense 24 Analysis Unit. Good to have you on the program. Now, before we begin with analyzing the latest here, I'm just going to, as we said, this peace process, this potential ceasefire, as everyone is calling it now, let's get the freshest, latest from Donald Trump in the Oval Office today of what he thinks is the current state of this process. Take a listen.
I think we're going to have we have a ceasefire on a lot of areas, and so far that's all held very well. And getting that ceasefire, they had a lot of guns pointing at each other. You had some soldiers, unfortunately, surrounded by other soldiers, and they are going to be, I believe we're going to have, pretty soon have a full ceasefire, and then we're going to have a contract. And the contract's being negotiated, the contract in terms of dividing up the lands, et cetera, it's being negotiated as we speak.
All right, so we have a typical Trump fashion, really, a lot of things. We have to analyze this, we have to unpack it. What do you make of his statements there, and how close are we to a veritable, real, true ceasefire?
First of all, hello and thank you for having me here. Unfortunately for us, when we are trying to comment the situation, we are struggling with the lack of important informations coming from behind the scene, because, of course, we can watch Oval Office statements, or we can watch some of the press conferences from the Saudi Arabia format or from other diplomatic visits. But I think the core is behind the scene. And that's why I'm always very careful with any kind of hard facets. I think we are close to some kind of a game changer for the diplomats in the context of this diplomatic area. On the other hand, I'm much more skeptical about the practical side of the military fightings on the battlefields. Why? Because I'm always comparing this with the same maybe situation during the Korean War on the Korean Peninsula. We saw that even with some agreements, there was a large offensive from the Chinese side just before the signing of this ceasefire agreements and finishing this conflict or stabilizing conflict. Formally, there is a conflict still. So I think we need to have two different perspectives. First, diplomatic, and I think here there is a chance for strengthening some kind of agreements between Russia and Ukrainian, of course, with U.S. As a mediator or even a playmaker in that. Because Donald Trump, I think, is describing himself as a playmaker. But on the other hand, we need to be very careful with comparing this with the military field, where there will be another strikes, another fightings, and I think till the last hour, till the last minute, we will see some skirmishes or some missile strikes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, as you said, there are all these nuances at the moment. We know that things are going on. You mentioned behind the scenes. We've had now a few meetings in Saudi Arabia, U.S. officials, Ukrainian officials, Russian officials meeting there. There's due to be another round of these talks in the next days. So what do you think? Is this going to be now where the behind the scenes come forward? We'll have something concrete. What do you make of the next steps coming out of the Saudi talks? We've had Witkoff say on the U.S. side that this is going to now be that moment. Will it be that moment for something more substantial?
Unfortunately, this kind of a full-scale war is not easy to solve with one agreement. Why? Because there is so many different fields they need to cover by the diplomatic discussions, so that this is impossible to reach all of them during even the long-term negotiations like this one in Riyadh, in Saudi Arabia, sorry, in Jeddah. So I think we might be close to some kind of near ceasefire agreement. But I'm very skeptical, and I disagree that both sides, with U.S., with even some other states from Europe, for example, they are able to reach the full agreement to finish this war, to stop all of the aggression from Russian side against the Ukrainian soil. So I am a little bit optimistic when we are thinking about stopping some forms of warfare. On the other hand, when I'm thinking about the long-term perspective, about the strategy of Kremlin, I'm much more pessimist compared to the short-term agreements and maybe stopping some basic fightings on the battlefields.
We've had a lot of back and forth. We had these decisions by the U.S. first to reduce aid completely, to turn off intelligence, then it was suddenly back on. It seems very much that the only person really gaining anything from that is Vladimir Putin. Is he ultimately behind all of this? I mean, it seems Trump is in a way stepping forward, saying he has everything in control, everything's going according to plan, as he said here. Is there a perception that he will finally realize that the Kremlin potentially is playing a bit Trump here?
Again, there is not only black and white situation when we are describing the position of Donald Trump administration toward this conflict. I think this president and also his main advisors are always close to the intelligence community from the United States. Of course, intelligence community reports and also analysis. So maybe they are trying to build a picture for the mediators, for the diplomats toward Russia, and also to achieve some goals in the context of other actors around Ukraine. But in the background, I think they are well prepared to understand the Russian structure of their decision-making process, of their capabilities, of their goals and aims, not only against Ukraine, but also against other states in Europe, or even when we think about the Sino-Russian relations. So, of course, they are playing something. They are predicting to be the playmakers, game changers in the holistic area of the global international relations. But on the other hand, when we are closing doors to the White House, to Oval Office, there is, I think, a much more pragmatic approach to support Ukraine, to support European partners. I think we need to balance our emotions, and also emotions coming from the White House, with a much more pragmatic approach, which is created in this behind the scene, in this background, as I mentioned before.
Mm-hmm. I want to also come back to Trump's statement. He said a lot in this, looking also at things like dividing up the lands, et cetera, territory. I mean, this is something very, very dear to the Ukrainians, also a sensitive issue for the Russians. How realistic is this that, as you said, if we move away from emotions, that anything can be done? I know, again, this is something delicate. We don't know how it's going to turn out, but how realistic is an agreement in terms of any sort of territorial discussion between these two sides?
It's a very difficult and very delicate issue. Of course, sovereignty and also accepting legal borders is the pillar of our Western approach to global relations after, of course, Second World War. But on the other hand, I think there is a lot of question marks about the future capabilities to counter Russian occupation of some parts of Ukraine. So I think there is a lot of potential solutions. Some of them are really bad for our own goals, mostly for our values. But when we are watching this warfare and we are trying to analyze, for instance, Ukrainian capabilities in long-term perspective, there is some kind of a gray zone when we think about the role of diplomats, and also these actions coming from American side toward this negotiation. So I hope Ukraine will be fully control their own territories, fully accepted by the global community after collapse of Soviet Union. But on the other hand, I'm watching the situation and I'm trying to understand that might be not the most optimistic story in the future.
Mm-hmm. Just closing question really briefly, and I want to tap into your defense expertise as well. Just in today's meeting as well in the Oval, we've had Hegseth, their defense secretary, and Trump, they awarded this contract, this Boeing contract, to the F-47. Maybe, I don't know, coincidence with this 47th president, I don't know. But what do you make of this announcement of this fighter jet? I mean, Portugal and Canada have already said that they're not going to be looking at new fighter jets from the U.S. Could this now not be as successful for other countries? What do you make of this, just briefly at the end now?
3 messages, very shortly. First message to China. We are able to build 6th-generation fighters very well. We are ready to contest you in this technological race. Second message, we are strengthening our Boeing capabilities because this aerospace company is key element for our military industry. We want to send a message. They are very crucial for the United States economy. And the third thing, as you mentioned before, this is the message for U.S. allies. We will provide in the next few years some most of sophisticated weaponry, and you need to look on our industry. You need to cooperate with us. So I think this is a straight message to adversaries, but also to allies of United States.
Mm-hmm. Very clear message indeed. And remember that European allies still accounting, I think, 60% of their military supplies from the United States, despite Europe trying to chart its own way. Look, we'll analyze another time. Pleasure to speak to you there, Jacek Raubo, Defense 24 Analysis Unit.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you. And thank you for watching. That concludes this edition of World Talks, but stay tuned for more news and commentary right here on TVP World. Goodbye.